Hey there YouTube lovers, my name is BB8 and today we are going to review Metroid Fusion. I know it's been a while since I've last done a retro review, which I've only done one retro review on the channel, that being Banjo-Kazooie, which did release on the Nintendo 64 originally, but with Nintendo Switch Online, I'm actually getting the chance to play some old games. Like Nintendo 64, Nintendo Switch Online gave me a chance to play Banjo-Kazooie, Mario 64, and now Metroid Fusion. And I thought, I've already done a review for Metroid Dread, if you want to go and check that out, so I thought I would review Metroid Fusion as well. So, without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? For the gameplay. The gameplay is just what I expect from a 2D Metroid game. I've only played Metroid Dread and Metroid Fusion so far, so I thought after Metroid Fusion came to Nintendo Switch Online plus expansion pack, I knew I had to buy the expansion pack for a second year just to play this, because, like, come on, it's Metroid. I knew I had to dive into this Metroid game. And if you come to think about it, the gameplay isn't the worst. Like, I do think the gameplay in Fusion does have some quality of life improvements compared to Super Metroid that came out in 1994. Because Fusion is more story-driven compared to Super Metroid, making Fusion the first story-driven Metroid game. And I do think the graphics in Metroid Fusion, I can't really judge the graphics because this game came out in 2002. But I do think for the hardware it came out on and the year it released, the graphics do look pretty good. Like, I do think with Metroid Fusion having a bit more detailed world building than previous Metroid games, I do feel like Fusion pulled off its world building quite well. Because, yet again, since I did play Metroid Dread before, I was expecting Fusion to be set on a planet, like Dread was. And the only thing I can say for now is I do like the approach of the world building they took, with this taking us to, like, a space station and stuff. Each of them being its own individual sector, but the structure of Metroid Fusion's world building is a bit different to Dread, but I don't mind that. Like, Metroid Fusion does pull it off well with its world building and amazing graphics for the time this game released. The only feature I can say is missing is the ability to link Metroid Fusion to Metroid Prime on the GameCube. I can see that feature's missing though, because yet again, GameCube is not available on Nintendo Switch Online, unfortunately, but with Metroid Prime Remastered recently making its way to the Switch, which I still need to get my hands on Metroid Prime Remastered, which I will leave a review video once I get my hands on the game and have gone through it. But I do think it would have made a ton of sense if games like Metroid Fusion had compatibility with Metroid Prime Remastered, like the original, similar to how the Pokemon games could have had compatibility with Pokemon Home and Pokemon Stadium as well as the N64 version of Mario Golf and the Game Boy Advance. No, not Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Color version of Mario Golf. And I think with cross-system game linking, I feel like that's the only feature I think is missing here. But if they do bring that in to Nintendo Switch Online in the future, that would be a win-win. For the story, I do think the first story-driven Metroid game was pulled off quite well for its time, because, yet again, the first 3 Metroid games weren't story-driven like Prime and Fusion, but Fusion does pull off its first story-driven Metroid game quite well, taking us to the space station on the surface of SR-388. The story does manage to deliver the lore on the X-Parasites as well. Like, I thought the main villain in the game being an X-Parasite, being the host to like Samus or something like that. I feel like the villain, in my opinion, wasn't quite there with the Emmys and Ravenbeak from Metroid Dread, but I do think fighting off a fake Samus in the game, I felt like the villain was alright, but in my opinion, Dark Samus from the Prime games was actually better than this fake Samus that we have in Fusion. So for the summary, the gameplay, I'm going to give an 8 out of 10. The gameplay for Metroid Fusion is exactly what I expect from a Metroid game. May not have the abilities that Dread has, but Fusion did have enough quality of life of improvements compared to Metroid, Metroid 2, the Return of Samus, and Super Metroid. I do think they did it quite well with the quality of life improvements. The graphics, I'm going to give an 8.5 out of 10, because yet again, for the time that this game came out, the game does look pretty good on the Game Boy Advance. Because yet again, I do think the atmosphere of each area is handled quite well, with the climates, such as the more hot and cold areas, do manage to make the graphics pop out quite well. And for the story, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. It was pulled off quite well for the first story-driven Metroid game, but although I do think the story was a bit too short, but don't forget, this game did come out in 2002, on the Game Boy Advance, so I'm not really gonna judge the length of the story. But I do think the story does manage to give us more on the X-Parasite lore quite well. The characters, I'm going to give a 6 out of 10, because yet again, there wasn't that many characters to explore within the game, because although the bosses I did find a bit frustrating, the fake Samus within the game though, I feel like Dark Samus was actually better than this game's fake Samus. And the fact that this game doesn't have that many characters to explore, that's why I'm giving characters a 6. For the music, I'm going to give it an 8.7 out of 10. Because yet again, the music on the Game Boy Advance, this is probably one of the best Game Boy Advance soundtracks I've heard. I'm still playing through The Legend of Zelda Minish Cap, so I can't really have my full impression on the Minish Cap soundtrack, but I do think the music of Fusion was pretty good. The difficulty, I'm going to give it a hard, because yet again, Metroid Fusion is a difficult game. So if you were to go through the whole game without using suspend points or the rewind feature that Nintendo Switch Online has, the game would be pretty difficult. And for the length, I'm going to give it 5 to 7 hours. Because yet again, this game is short, but the game did come out on the Game Boy Advance in 2002, so the length isn't really a big deal because of the time the game came out, but I do think the game was pretty good for its length. The audience, I'm going to give it a 7+. There's no like blood or gore to deal with in Metroid Fusion, and compared to Dread, the violence isn't quite there. But I do think they do manage to pull off the whole action quite well in this game. And for the perk, I'm still trying to come up with a version of my perk system for my retro reviews, so I thought I would come up with the perk system right here. Because I did introduce my perk system in my review of Splatoon 3, but I needed to do a different set depending on what kind of review I'm doing. And since this is a retro review, I haven't come up with an alternate version for my perk system for my retro reviews or my video game adaptation reviews, because when I come to review the Super Mario Bros. Movie, which does come out in a few weeks, I will be bringing the perk system to it as well. So, since I haven't been able to come up with a perk system for my retro reviews yet, when I do my retro review for The Legend of Zelda the Minish Cap, I will go into detail with it. But for now, I'm going to give Metroid Fusion the Collector Perk. Overall, I give Metroid Fusion a 9.1 out of 10. Metroid Fusion, being the first lore and story-driven Metroid game, has pulled off quite well with great graphics, creative world building, and great sound design, thanks to its music. And I can safely say that Metroid Fusion is one of the best Game Boy Advance titles. I do heavily recommend this game, because if you eventually pick up Nintendo Switch Online Plus expansion pack, or an actual Game Boy Advance to play it on, if you can get your hands on one, I do think Metroid Fusion is a must-have when it comes to the Game Boy Advance. And yet again, although the Game Boy Advance doesn't have a fair share or that much memorable titles, well, it does have the Minish Cap, it has Golden Sun, the third generation of Pokemon. Like, although the Game Boy Advance doesn't have a huge library compared to other Nintendo platforms, I do think Metroid Fusion is one of the best Game Boy Advance games, and I heavily recommend that you check this out. So guys, what did you think of my retro review for Metroid Fusion? Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and turn your notification bell on so you don't miss another retro review like this one. I do need to do some more retro reviews, since I haven't really done a retro review since Banjo-Kazooie, but I am going to start rolling out some more retro reviews as time goes on, because with Game Boy and Game Boy Advance recently coming to Nintendo Switch Online, I think I might as well bring more retro reviews into the mix. And I will see you all in a future video. BB8 out.